The crystal wine glass trembled in Victoria Hartwell's manicured fingers as she set it down with deliberate precision on the mahogany dining table. Her steel gray eyes fixed on me with the kind of cold calculation that had probably frozen countless hearts over her 63 years of life. "Natalie, sweetie," she began, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that only comes from generations of inherited wealth. "I think we need to have a realistic conversation about your wedding venue expectations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The Hartwell family dining room suddenly felt smaller, as if the ornate wallpaper and oil paintings of long-dead ancestors were closing in around me. Derek's hand found mine under the table, his thumb tracing nervous circles across my knuckles. We'd been planning this moment for weeks, knowing this conversation was inevitable, but nothing could have prepared me for the surgical precision with which Victoria was about to dissect my dreams. "Rosewood Manor Estate," Victoria continued, pulling out her phone and sliding it across the polished surface toward me. The screen displayed the venue's website, showing sprawling gardens, a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers, and the kind of elegance that made fairy tales seem possible. "Do you have any idea what a venue like this costs? We're talking about $50,000 just for the venue rental, not including catering, flowers, or any of the other necessities for a proper Hartwell wedding." Cassandra, Derek's younger sister, smirked from across the table while adjusting her pearl necklace. At 28, she'd already mastered the art of looking down on people despite being seated at the same level. "Mother's right, Natalie. Maybe we should look at something more within your range. There's that community center on Maple Street, or perhaps the church basement could work for the reception." The words hit me like physical blows, each suggestion more insulting than the last. I'd spent the last 6 months working double shifts at Henderson's Bakery, my hands constantly smelling of flour and vanilla, saving every penny for what I thought would be the most important day of my life. What they didn't know, what nobody except my accountant and lawyer knew, was that those calloused hands had been building something far more valuable than wedding savings. Derek's jaw tightened as he squeezed my hand harder. "Mom, that's enough. Natalie and I will figure out the venue situation ourselves. We don't need your approval or your money." Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, darling, but you do need my approval if you want any of your father's business associates at this wedding. The Hartwells have a reputation to maintain in Westfield County. We can't have people thinking we've lost our standards." She turned her attention back to me, her smile as warm as winter frost. "I'm not trying to be cruel, dear. I'm simply being practical. A bakery assistant's salary, even with Derek's teacher income, simply won't stretch to accommodate the kind of wedding the Hartwell name requires." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its rhythmic ticking, as if waiting to see how I would respond. I could feel the weight of generations of Hartwell superiority pressing down on me, the expectation that I would crumble under the pressure and accept their version of what my life should look like. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who'd been beaten down or defeated. It was the quiet, confident smile of someone who knew exactly what cards she was holding, even if everyone else at the table thought she was playing with an empty hand. "You know what, Victoria," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You're absolutely right. Rosewood Manor Estate is expensive. Incredibly expensive, actually." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly expecting me to concede defeat and suggest the church basement after all. Cassandra was already reaching for her phone, probably to text her society friends about how the gold digger had finally been put in her place. "But here's the thing," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out my own phone. "Sometimes things aren't quite what they appear to be." The foundation of my secret had been laid 3 years earlier, long before I'd ever met Derek Hartwell in the produce aisle of Westfield Market. While Victoria assumed I'd spent my entire adult life behind a bakery counter, the truth was far more complex and infinitely more satisfying than anything she could have imagined. My name is Natalie Brooks, and at 29 I had become something that would have given Victoria Hartwell nightmares if she'd known. A self-made millionaire who chose to work at Henderson's Bakery, not out of necessity, but out of genuine love for the craft of baking. The flour-dusted apron I wore every morning wasn't a symbol of limitation. It was camouflage for one of the most successful event planning empires in the tri-state area. It had started during my junior year of college, when I'd organized a friend's wedding on a shoestring budget that somehow looked like it cost 10 times what we'd actually spent. Word spread through campus, then through the local community, and before I knew it, I was booking events every weekend while finishing my business degree. What began as a side hustle to pay for textbooks had evolved into Brooks Event Solutions, a company that now operated under 6 different subsidiary names across 3 states. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Victoria Hartwell was lecturing me about understanding costs, I had personally planned weddings that cost more than most people's houses. The difference was, I did it from behind the scenes, allowing my carefully selected front managers to interact with high society clients, while I remained the anonymous genius orchestrating everything from venue selection to napkin folding technique. My business model was built on what I called invisible excellence. Wealthy clients got the perfect event they dreamed of, but they never knew that the woman who could make their wildest fantasies come true was the same person they might ignore if they passed her on the street. It was a strategy that had made me incredibly wealthy while keeping me completely under the radar of the social circles that people like Victoria inhabited. Derek knew I had a successful side business, but even he didn't fully understand the scope of what I'd built. To him, I was the sweet, hard-working woman who made the most incredible croissants he'd ever tasted, and occasionally planned events for friends. He had no idea that occasionally planning events meant generating revenue that would make his mother's inherited wealth look like pocket change. The beauty of my situation was that it had allowed me to see Derek for who he truly was, not what he represented. When we met 18 months ago, he was shopping for ingredients to make dinner for his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had just gotten out of the hospital. He was patient, kind, and completely unimpressed by my flour-stained jeans and messy ponytail. Our relationship had grown organically, built on shared morning coffee runs and long walks through Westfield Park, far away from the pressure and expectations of his family's social obligation. But now, sitting in the Hartwell dining room while Victoria systematically tried to dismantle my wedding dreams, I realized that our bubble of authenticity was about to burst in the most spectacular way possible. Because 3 weeks ago, when Derek and I had toured Rosewood Manor Estate and fallen in love with its old-world charm and breathtaking gardens, I had made a decision that would change everything. I had bought it, not just booked it for our wedding day, but purchased the entire property through one of my subsidiary companies. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Ashfords, had been struggling with maintenance costs and property taxes for years. When they'd quietly put it on the market, looking for a buyer who would preserve the estate's historic character rather than tear it down for development, I'd known it was meant to be mine. The purchase had been completed just 5 days ago, with the paperwork routed through so many legal entities that it would take a team of forensic accountants weeks to trace it back to me. Thomas Reynolds, the venue manager who had been retained as part of the sale, was the only person at Rosewood Manor who knew the true identity of the new owner. Everyone else, including the Ashfords themselves, believed they had sold to a mysterious investment group called Heritage Properties LLC. As Victoria continued her lecture about financial reality and appropriate venues for people of my station, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Thomas just yesterday. He'd called to confirm the final details of our ownership transfer and to ask about my plans for the property's future. Miss Brooks, he'd said in his distinguished British accent, a remnant of his decades managing high-end venues in London before emigrating to the United States. I have to say, in 30 years of event management, I've never encountered a situation quite like this. When would you like to reveal your ownership to your fiancé and his family? I'd been standing in the bakery's kitchen at the time, watching the sunrise paint the sky outside the window while I prepared the day's first batch of cinnamon rolls. The juxtaposition of my simple surroundings with the magnitude of what I'd just accomplished wasn't lost on me. I think, I'd told Thomas, that timing will present itself naturally. Some lessons are best learned through experience rather than explanation. Now, as Victoria's voice droned on about the importance of knowing one's place and realistic expectations, I knew that moment had arrived. The woman who had spent 18 months treating me like an unwelcome intruder in her son's life was about to learn that appearances could be more deceiving than she'd ever imagined. Derek was growing increasingly agitated beside me, his usually calm demeanor fracturing under the weight of his mother's relentless criticism. "Mom, I think you've made your point. Natalie doesn't need to justify her choices to you or anyone else." "Derek, honey," Victoria replied with exaggerated patience, "I understand you're being protective, and that's admirable, but someone needs to inject some reality into this conversation. Rosewood Manor Estate doesn't just cost $50,000 for the venue. There's the catering minimum of $30,000, the floral arrangements that start at $15,000, the photography package that runs at least $8,000. We're talking about a wedding that would cost well over $100,000 before you even consider the dress, the music, or the honeymoon." Cassandra nodded sagely, as if she were an expert on wedding planning rather than someone whose idea of hard work was choosing which charity gala to attend on any given weekend. "Maybe you could do something small and intimate instead, Natalie. A garden party at the local park, perhaps." very casual and authentic. The condescension in her voice made my teeth ache, but I maintained my calm exterior. Years of dealing with demanding clients and impossible deadlines had taught me the value of patience and strategic time. Victoria and Cassandra were hanging themselves with their own rope. I just needed to give them enough length to complete the job. You know, I said quietly, setting my own wine glass down with deliberate care, you're absolutely right about the costs. Rosewood Manor Estate is incredibly expensive, but sometimes, Victoria, the most important question isn't whether someone can afford something. Sometimes the question is whether they've already taken care of it. The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Where before there had been expectant superiority, now there was confusion tinged with the first hint of unease. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a slight frown, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit the picture she'd been assembling. What exactly do you mean by that, dear? She asked, her voice carrying a note of caution that hadn't been there before. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Thomas Reynolds' number. I said, hitting the call button and putting the phone on speaker.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That maybe it's time we cleared up a few misconceptions about what I can and cannot afford. The phone rang twice before Thomas answered with his characteristic professionalism. Good evening, Miss Brooks. How may I assist you? The confusion in Victoria's eyes deepened, and I could see Derek's head turning toward me with growing curiosity. Cassandra had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Hello, Thomas? I replied, my voice carrying a warmth and familiarity that clearly surprised everyone at the table. I'm calling because I'm here with my fiancé's family, discussing wedding venue options. They seem to be under the impression that Rosewood Manor Estate might be outside our price range. Could you clarify our current booking status? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Thomas smiling. Of course, Miss Brooks. Let me pull up your file. The sound of typing filled the silence, followed by Thomas clearing his throat diplomatically. I show here that Rosewood Manor Estate is fully reserved for your use on June 15th, with all associated costs taken care of. The venue, catering, florals, photography, and musical arrangements have all been handled according to your specifications. Victoria's face had gone very pale, and her hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Derek was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of amazement and dawning realization. Thomas, I continued, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have, could you remind me of the total cost for our arrangements? Certainly. The comprehensive package for your wedding comes to $147,000, all of which has been paid in full. We also have your deposit for the exclusive use of the grounds for the entire weekend, which brings the total to $162,000. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ice settling in Victoria's water glass. Cassandra had set her wine down with trembling fingers, and Derek was looking at me as if he'd never seen me before. Thank you, Thomas, I said pleasantly. I think that clears up any confusion about our venue situation. We'll see you next week for the final walkthrough. Of course, Miss Brooks, please give my regards to Mr. Hartwell and his family. We're all very excited to host your celebration. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse, then looked around the table at three very different expressions of shock. Derek's was tinged with admiration and growing understanding. Cassandra appeared to be calculating frantically in her head, trying to reconcile the numbers she'd just heard with the woman she'd been dismissing all evening. Victoria looked like someone had just informed her that gravity had been suspended and she might float away at any moment. I think, I said gently, reaching for Derek's hand, that we might need to have a conversation about assumptions and what happens when we make them without having all the facts. Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. How is this possible? You work at a bakery. I do work at a bakery, I confirmed with a smile. I also own and operate the most successful event planning company in the tri-state area. Brooks Event Solutions has been coordinating luxury weddings and corporate events for the past 6 years. We handle everything from intimate gatherings for 50 people to galas for 1,500. Last year alone, we generated just over $12 million in revenue. Derek's hand tightened around mine, and I could see the pieces clicking into place in his mind. All those weekend trips I'd taken for friends' events, the phone calls I'd taken at odd hours, always stepping into another room for privacy. The way I always seemed to know exactly what questions to ask when we'd toured potential venues. 12 million, Victoria repeated faintly. In revenue, not profit. I clarified, though the profit margins in luxury event planning are quite generous when you know what you're doing. The key is building relationships with vendors, understanding client psychology, and never ever underestimating someone based on their appearance or their day job. Cassandra was the first to recover her composure, though her voice carried none of its earlier smugness. But why work at a bakery if you have such a successful business? It was a fair question, and one that got to the heart of who I was and why I'd made the choices that had brought me to this moment. Because I love baking, I replied simply. I love the precision of measuring ingredients, the alchemy of turning flour and eggs into something beautiful and delicious. I love the early morning quiet of the bakery kitchen, and the satisfaction of seeing customers smile when they taste something I've made. I paused, looking directly at Victoria before continuing. But more than that, I love what working at the bakery has taught me about people. I've learned that the customer who tips well when they're buying a single muffin is usually kinder than the one who complains about the price of a custom cake. I've learned that respect isn't something you earn through your bank account, it's something you give because everyone deserves. The words hung in the air between us, and I could see their impact registering on Victoria's face. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted and she wasn't sure which direction led to safety. Derek turned to face me fully, his eyes bright with a mixture of love and amazement. Natalie, why didn't you tell me about the scope of your business? I mean, I knew you were successful, but $12 million? I squeezed his hand gently, understanding his confusion. Because I wanted to be sure you loved me for who I am, not what I've accomplished. When we met, you weren't trying to impress me or win me over, because you thought I might be useful to you somehow. You were just being yourself, being kind and genuine and real. That's precious. Derek, that's right. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it lacked the commanding authority it had carried earlier in the evening. I don't understand. If you have that kind of success, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think that I was just a bakery worker who wasn't good enough for your son? I finished gently.
Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer except love. And unfortunately, Victoria, the answer to that question has been pretty clear for the past 18 months. The truth of my words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, muffling any response Victoria might have made. I could see her mind working, probably reviewing every snide comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment when she'd made it clear that she considered me beneath her family's standards. I need to understand something, Derek said slowly, his voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. When we toured Rosewood Manor last month, and you asked all those detailed questions about vendor relationships and coordination logistics, you weren't just being thorough as a bride, were you? I smiled at the memory of that day, how hard it had been to maintain my cover while walking through a venue that I was already in the process of purchasing. I was being thorough as someone who's coordinated hundreds of events and knows exactly what questions separate a good venue from a great one, but I was also falling in love with the place as your future bride. Both things were true at the same time. Thomas had done an excellent job that day of maintaining the fiction that I was simply another potential client. He'd answered my questions with professional thoroughness while giving no hint that we'd spent hours on the phone discussing renovation plans and staffing changes. Even Derek had no idea that the random call I'd taken during our tour had actually been Thomas confirming that the previous owners had accepted our offer. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its deep bronze notes reverberating through the Hartwell dining room like a funeral bell. Victoria remained frozen in her chair, her carefully applied makeup doing little to hide the pallor that had crept across her face. The revelation that her son's fiancé wasn't just successful but wealthy beyond anything the Hartwell family had imagined seemed to have short-circuited her ability to process information normally. Cassandra was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice carrying a tremor that betrayed her usual confidence. Natalie, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. You're saying you own an event planning company, but surely you don't mean you personally coordinate these million-dollar events. I reached into my purse and withdrew a leather portfolio that I'd brought specifically for this moment, though I'd hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Inside were photographs from some of my most prestigious events, each one representing months of planning and coordination. I spread them across the mahogany table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. This was the Morrison Chen wedding last spring, I said, pointing to a photograph of a breathtaking garden ceremony where every flower had been imported from Ecuador and the bride's dress had been hand-sewn by Italian seamstresses. 500 guests, $3 million budget. I coordinated everything from the helicopter arrival of the wedding party to the synchronized drone light show during their first dance. Derek leaned forward to examine the photographs more closely, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching awe.
These look like they belong in magazines. They do, I replied, flipping to another photograph showing an elaborate reception with ice sculptures and a 12-tier cake that had required structural engineering calculations. This event was featured in Luxury Weddings Quarterly and Wedding Elegance International. The Pemberton anniversary celebration, 2 years ago, the client wanted to recreate the Palace of Versailles in their backyard, complete with period musicians and historically accurate French cuisine. Victoria's hands had begun to shake slightly as she reached for one of the photographs, studying it with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. But how? How does someone go from planning college events to coordinating celebrations that cost more than most people's houses? It was a reasonable question and one that deserved a thoughtful answer. My journey hadn't been accidental. It had been the result of careful strategy, relentless work, and a willingness to learn from every mistake along the way. It started with understanding that luxury isn't about spending money, I explained, settling back in my chair as I prepared to tell them a story they clearly needed to hear. It's about creating experiences that feel effortless and perfect, even when they're incredibly complex behind the scenes. My first big breakthrough came during my senior year of college, when I planned what the campus newspaper called the wedding of the decade for my professor's daughter. The memory of that event still made me smile. Elizabeth Warren, my business strategy professor, had approached me after hearing about several successful campus events I'd coordinated. Her daughter Melissa was getting married to the son of a prominent tech entrepreneur, and the family had already been disappointed by 2 different high-end wedding planners, who seemed more interested in showing off their own creativity than understanding what the couple actually wanted. The budget was relatively modest by current standards, only $75,000, but the expectations were enormous, I continued. The groom's family expected technology integration and modern sophistication. The bride's family wanted traditional elegance and timeless beauty. Both sides had very specific cultural requirements that needed to be honored without making either side feel like their traditions were being treated as secondary. Derek was listening with complete attention now, and I could see him starting to understand the scope of what I'd been. How did you manage to satisfy everyone? By listening more than I talked and by understanding that the best solutions often come from combining seemingly incompatible elements rather than choosing between them, We created a ceremony that honored both families' cultural traditions while incorporating subtle technology that enhanced rather than dominated the experience. The result was something that felt both ancient and cutting-edge, traditional and innovative. I pulled out another photograph, this one showing a ceremony space where traditional floral arrangements were enhanced by nearly invisible LED lighting that changed colors subtly throughout the event. The key was making the technology serve the emotion rather than the other way around. Guests didn't notice the dozens of cameras capturing every moment, or the sound system that allowed everyone to hear the vows perfectly regardless of where they sat, or the climate control that kept everyone comfortable without creating any distracting noise. Victoria was studying the photograph with growing understanding, and I could see her beginning to recognize the level of sophistication required to execute such an event seamlessly. The logistics alone must have been nightmarish. They were, I agree. But that's where I discovered my real talent wasn't just in creative design. It was in project management and problem solving under pressure. When the florist's truck broke down 3 hours before the ceremony, I had backup arrangements delivered from 2 different suppliers and coordinated the setup so seamlessly that nobody ever knew there had been a problem. That wedding had changed everything for me. Warren's husband happened to be the CEO of a major consulting firm, and several of their guests owned businesses that regularly needed event coordination for corporate functions and personal celebrations. Within 6 months, I had more potential clients than I could handle as a college student, which led to my first major business decision. Instead of trying to do everything myself, I started building a network of specialists, I explained, turning to another section of my portfolio that showed organizational charts and vendor relationships. Master florists, award-winning photographers, chefs who had trained in Michelin-starred restaurants, musicians who had performed with symphony orchestras. I didn't try to become an expert in every aspect of event planning. I became an expert in finding the best people and coordinating their work. Cassandra was now leaning forward as well, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. But how did you afford to work with such high-level vendors when you were just starting out? By offering them something more valuable than immediate payment, I said, smiling at the memory of those early negotiations. Exposure to clients who could afford their premium services and the opportunity to be part of events that would enhance their portfolio. I also learned to negotiate payment structures that aligned everyone's incentives. Instead of paying flat fees, I offered percentage-based compensation tied to client satisfaction and repeat business. The strategy had been risky but effective. By aligning my vendors' financial success with the quality of their work and the happiness of my clients, I'd created a network of professionals who were invested in making every event exceptional. Word spread quickly through wealthy social circles, and within 2 years of graduating college, I was booking events for families whose names appeared regularly in financial newspapers and society magazines. The real turning point came when Margaret Astington hired me to plan her daughter's engagement party. I continued, reaching for a photograph that showed an outdoor evening event with thousands of fairy lights creating a magical canopy above elegantly dressed guests. Mrs. Astington was known for hosting some of the most exclusive social events on the East Coast, and she had very specific requirements that had driven away several other planners. Derek raised an eyebrow. What kind of requirement? She wanted an event that would be talked about for years, but she also insisted that it feel intimate and personal rather than showy or ostentatious. I explained. The guest list included senators, CEOs, and celebrities, but she wanted everyone to feel like they were at a close friend's backyard gathering rather than a formal corporate function. The challenge had been enormous, creating intimacy for 200 guests while maintaining the level of sophistication expected by people accustomed to the finest experiences money could buy required a completely different approach than anything I'd attempted before. I spent weeks studying Miss Astington's personal style and family history, I said, showing them photographs of the planning process, including mood boards and detailed sketches. I learned that she had grown up on a farm in Virginia, and that her happiest memories were of summer evenings spent on her grandmother's porch, listening to family stories while fireflies danced in the garden. Victoria's expression had softened slightly as she examined the photographs, and I could see her beginning to understand that successful event planning wasn't just about logistics and vendor management. It was about storytelling and emotional connection. So you recreated her grandmother's porch? Derek asked. I recreated the feeling of her grandmother's porch while accommodating 200 guests in formal attire, I corrected. We transformed her estate's back garden into something that felt like an enchanted southern evening, complete with vintage porch swings, mason jar lighting, and a menu that featured elevated versions of traditional comfort food. The photographs showed guests in evening wear sitting on antique porch swings, laughing and talking in small groups while servers in casual but elegant attire moved among them, offering drinks and hors d'oeuvres. The lighting was warm and golden, creating intimate conversation areas throughout the garden, while still allowing everyone to see and be seen. The music was provided by a bluegrass quartet that had been trained at Juilliard, playing sophisticated arrangements of traditional folk songs. I continued. The bar served premium whiskeys and wines, but they were presented in mason jars and vintage glasses that made the whole experience feel relaxed and authentic. Cassandra picked up one of the photographs showing the dessert station, where an elegant display featured what appeared to be homemade pies and cakes alongside more traditional party pastries. This must have cost a fortune to execute. It did, I admitted, but Miss Astington told me afterward that it was the first party she'd hosted in 20 years, where she actually enjoyed herself instead of worrying about whether everything was going according to plan. More importantly, her guests talked about that party for months afterward, and several of them hired me for their own events. That single party had established my reputation in circles where discretion was valued as highly as creativity. Miss Astington's guests included some of the wealthiest and most influential families in the region, and her endorsement carried more weight than any advertising campaign could have provided. Within a year, I was booking events that required six-figure budgets and coordinating celebrations for clients who valued privacy and exclusivity above everything else, I explained, showing them photographs from subsequent events that demonstrated increasing sophistication and scale. I learned to work with security teams for high-profile clients, coordinate with private jet services for destination weddings, and manage guest lists that read like a who's who of American business and politics. Derek was shaking his head in amazement. And you were doing all of this while finishing college? Initially, yes, though I quickly realized that trying to manage everything myself was unsustainable, I replied. By my junior year, I had incorporated Brooks Event Solutions and hired my first full-time employee. By graduation, I had a team of 12 people and was already expanding into corporate events and non-profit galas. Victoria had been unusually quiet throughout my explanation, but now she looked up from the photographs with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. This level of success, especially at such a young age, it's quite remarkable, but I still don't understand why you chose to work at a bakery when you could afford to do anything you wanted. It was the question I'd been expecting, and the one that got to the heart of who I was and what I valued.
The decision to work at Henderson's Bakery hadn't been about money or career advancement. It had been about maintaining connection to something real and grounding in a life that could easily have become consumed by luxury and artifice. When you spend your working life creating perfect experiences for other people, there's a risk of losing touch with what actually makes life meaningful, I said, choosing my words carefully. I love the work I do, but I also recognize that coordinating million-dollar parties isn't the same thing as creating genuine happiness or building authentic relationships. I paused, looking around the table at three faces that were now paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Working at the bakery grounds me. It reminds me that some of the most important moments in people's lives happen around simple pleasures. A mother buying her child's favorite cookies for a school celebration. A couple choosing their wedding cake together. An elderly man who comes in every Tuesday for the same blueberry muffin because it reminds him of his late wife. Derek's hand found mine again, and I could see understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you never seemed impressed by expensive restaurants or luxury shops. You weren't playing hard to get. You genuinely prefer simpler things. I prefer authentic things, I corrected gently. Sometimes authentic means a 5-star restaurant with a world-renowned chef, and sometimes it means a food truck that makes the best tacos in the city. The price tag doesn't determine the value, the experience does. Cassandra was studying one of the photographs more closely, her brow furrowed in concentration. Natalie, this event with the garden setting and the fairy lights, didn't something similar to this appear in Town and Country magazine about 3 years ago? I nodded, impressed by her attention to detail. It did. That was the Pemberton Ruby anniversary celebration I mentioned earlier. Town and Country featured it as their event of the year and used it as the cover story for their luxury entertaining issue. I remember that article, Victoria said slowly, her voice carrying a note of dawning recognition. They interviewed the event planner, but I don't recall the name being mentioned prominently. I prefer to let the events speak for themselves rather than making the planning process part of the story, I explained. My clients hire me to create perfect experiences for their guests, not to promote my own business. Discretion and invisibility are part of the service. It was a philosophy that had served me well but had also contributed to the misconceptions that had led to this evening's confrontation. By maintaining a low profile professionally while working at the bakery personally, I had created a perfect storm of misunderstanding about who I was and what I was capable of. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria's attempts to exclude me from the family were based on assumptions that were not only wrong but spectacularly wrong. The woman she considered unsuitable for her son wasn't just financially secure. I was probably wealthier than the entire Hartwell family combined. There's something else I think you should know, I said, reaching for the final section of my portfolio. The reason I was able to purchase Rosewood Manor Estate wasn't just because I could afford it. It was because I've been looking for the right property to serve as the flagship location for a new venture I'm launching. Derek's eyebrows rose. What kind of venture? A destination wedding and corporate retreat facility that combines luxury accommodation with sustainable practices and community engagement, I replied, spreading out architectural plans and environmental impact studies that had been months in the making. Rosewood Manor was perfect because it has the historic charm and natural beauty that clients want, but it also has the infrastructure to support modern sustainability initiatives. The plans showed extensive renovations that would transform the estate into something unprecedented in the luxury events industry. Solar panels disguised as traditional roofing materials, geothermal heating and cooling systems, organic gardens that would supply produce for the on-site restaurant, and partnerships with local artisans and suppliers that would benefit the entire Westfield County community. Victoria was examining the plans with growing interest, her earlier shock giving way to what appeared to be genuine fascination. These renovations would cost millions of dollars. They will, I agree. But they'll also create something that doesn't currently exist in this market, a luxury venue that allows clients to celebrate their most important moments, while also contributing positively to environmental conservation and local economic development. The concept had been developing in my mind for over 2 years, inspired by clients who increasingly wanted their celebrations to reflect their values as well as their aesthetic. The wealthy families I worked with were becoming more conscious of their environmental impact and more interested in supporting local communities, but existing luxury venues hadn't adapted to meet these evolving preferences. The renovation timeline is designed around our wedding, I continued, showing them a detailed project schedule. The essential improvements will be completed by June, with the more extensive sustainability initiatives being implemented over the following year. By next summer, Rosewood Manor will be the premier eco-luxury event venue on the East Coast. Cassandra was now leaning over the plans, tracing the proposed garden layouts with her finger. These organic gardens, would they actually supply enough produce for events? The gardens will provide specialty items and seasonal highlights, I explained. Heirloom tomatoes for summer events, herbs and edible flowers for spring celebrations, pumpkins and gourds for autumn gathering. The psychological impact of guests knowing their meal includes ingredients grown on the property creates a connection to the place that you can't achieve with even the highest quality imported ingredient. It was a level of detail and integration that went far beyond traditional event planning, and I could see all three of them beginning to understand that what I'd built wasn't just a business. It was a comprehensive approach to creating meaningful experience. Derek was shaking his head slowly, his expression mixing admiration with something that might have been bewilderment. Natalie, the scope of what you're describing, it's incredible. But why didn't you tell me about the Rosewood Manor purchase? Why let me think we were just hoping to book it for our wedding? His question was fair and it deserved an honest answer. The decision to keep the purchase secret, even from Derek, hadn't been made lightly, but it had been necessary for reasons that went beyond simple surprise or dramatic effect. Because I wanted to see how your family would react when they thought I had nothing to offer except love, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. And because I needed to know whether you would stand up for me even when you thought I couldn't defend myself. The truth of those words settled over the room like morning fog, changing the atmosphere and the stakes of our conversation. Victoria's face had gone pale again, but this time the pallor seemed to come from understanding rather than shock. Cassandra had stopped examining the plans and was looking at me with an expression that might have been the beginning of respect. You were testing us, Derek said quietly. I was protecting myself, I correct. I've learned that people's true character emerges when they think there are no consequences for their behavior. Tonight, when your mother and sister felt free to suggest that I should settle for a church basement because that's all someone like me deserved, they were showing me who they really are when they think nobody important is watching. The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back, and equally impossible to deny. Victoria's treatment of me over the past 18 months hadn't been a series of misunderstandings or cultural differences. It had been a deliberate campaign to make me feel unwelcome and unworthy. The silence that followed my words was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted earlier revelations. This was the heavy silence of people confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, the kind of pause that occurs when carefully constructed facades begin to crumble. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table, a nervous habit I'd never seen her display before. Natalie, she began, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. I think perhaps there have been some misunderstandings between us. I never intended to make you feel unwelcome in our family. Derek's sharp intake of breath was audible across the table. Even he could recognize the revisionist history being offered, the attempt to rewrite 18 months of deliberate slights and calculated insults as mere miscommunication. I kept my expression neutral, curious to see how far Victoria would go in attempting to reframe our relationship now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. What about last Christmas? Derek asked quietly, his voice carrying an edge I'd rarely heard before. When you told Natalie that her homemade gifts were charming in their simplicity, and then made sure everyone knew that thoughtful handmade presents were so much more meaningful than expensive store-bought items when someone has limited resources. Victoria's face flushed slightly, caught between the impossible task of defending her past behavior, and the growing realization that every conversation, every gathering, every interaction with me over the past year and a half, was now being viewed through a completely different lens. The condescending comments about my clothes, my job, my background, all of it had been witnessed by Derek and was now being reevaluated in light of what he'd learned about my actual circumstances. Or what about the engagement party? Cassandra added, unexpectedly, her voice barely above a whisper. When I suggested that Natalie might be more comfortable helping in the kitchen rather than mingling with the other guests because she'd know how to handle herself around catering staff, I remembered that evening with crystalline clarity. The Hartwell family had hosted an engagement celebration at their country club, and I had spent most of the evening being subtly but systematically excluded from conversations, redirected toward service areas, and treated like helpful hired help rather than the guest of honor. At the time I'd attributed it to social awkwardness and unfamiliarity with their circles. Now hearing Cassandra acknowledge the deliberate nature of that treatment, I felt a mixture of validation and sadness. The truth is, I said carefully, I noticed every slight, every dismissive comment, every attempt to make me feel like I didn't belong. But I also chose to give everyone the benefit of the doubt because I loved Derek and I hoped that time would change things between us. Derek was looking at his mother and sister with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of disappointment and dawning anger that suggested he was reassessing far more than just this evening's conversation. How many times did I ask you to give Natalie a chance? How many times did I tell you that she was special, that she made me happy, that I was planning to marry her regardless of your approval? Victoria's composure was beginning to crack, hairline fractures appearing in the smooth facade she'd maintained for decades. Derek, you have to understand, we were trying to protect you. When someone comes from such different circumstances, there are often complications that arise later in a marriage. Financial stress, social compatibility issues, different expectations about lifestyle and priority. You mean you were worried that I'd married a gold digger? Derek said bluntly, cutting through his mother's euphemisms with surgical precision. The accusation hung in the air between them, impossible to deny because it was so obviously accurate. Victoria had spent 18 months treating me like a fortune hunter who had somehow managed to ensnare her unsuspecting son, never imagining that her concerns about financial compatibility were not only misguided but ironically reversed.
I've been financially supporting local charities in Westfield County for 3 years, I said quietly, pulling out my phone and scrolling through a series of bank statements and donation records. The Children's Literacy Program at the Public Library, the Senior Nutrition Center, the Scholarship Fund for Community College Students. I've contributed over $400,000 to local organizations, always anonymously, because I believe in supporting the community where I live and work. The numbers on my phone screen told a story that none of them had ever suspected, a pattern of quiet generosity that had been flowing through their community while they worried about my ability to afford a proper wedding venue. Victoria leaned forward to examine the records, her face growing paler with each donation amount she read. The new playground equipment at Westfield Elementary, she murmured, recognizing one of the larger contributions. The one installed last spring that everyone wondered about because nobody knew who had funded it. $43,000, I confirmed. The old playground was becoming unsafe, but the school district didn't have the budget for replacement equipment. I heard about it from one of my regular bakery customers, whose daughter attends the school. Cassandra was scrolling through the donation history with increasing amazement. The senior center's new kitchen, the one that allowed them to expand their meal delivery program. That was $67,000, I nodded. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery volunteers there twice a week, and she mentioned that they were having to turn away elderly residents who needed meal support because their facilities couldn't handle the demand. The pattern of giving revealed something about my character that 18 months of family dinners and holiday gatherings had failed to communicate. These weren't tax-deductible charitable contributions made for public recognition or social advantage. They were targeted investments in specific community needs that I'd learned about through the relationships I'd built working at Henderson's Bakery. Derek was studying the donation records with an expression of growing wonder. Natalie, these contributions, they're massive. Why didn't you ever mention any of this? Because the point of anonymous giving is that it remains anonymous, I replied simply. The moment you start talking about your charitable work, it stops being about helping people and starts being about promoting yourself. I give because I can, and because I've been lucky enough to build something successful in a community that supported me while I was building it. Victoria was now examining the records with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose solution kept shifting just out of reach. Every assumption she'd made about my character, my motivations, and my suitability as a daughter-in-law was being systematically dismantled by evidence of generosity and community engagement that spanned years. The literacy program, she said slowly, that's been one of the library's most successful initiatives. They've been able to expand into 3 neighboring districts because of sustained funding from an anonymous donor. Reading opens doors, I said, thinking about the dozens of letters I'd received from program coordinators describing the impact of the funding. Children who develop strong reading skills early have better educational outcomes, better job prospects, better life opportunities. It's one of the most effective investments you can make in a community's future. The conversation was revealing layers of my life and values that had remained hidden throughout my relationship with Derek's family. Not because I was secretive by nature, but because they had never shown genuine interest in learning who I was beyond their superficial assessments of my job and background. Now confronted with evidence of the person I actually was rather than the person they'd assumed I must be, they were struggling to reconcile their prejudices with reality. There's something else I think you should know, I continued, reaching into my portfolio for a section I hadn't yet shared. The reason I was able to move so quickly on purchasing Rosewood Manor wasn't just because I had the capital available. It was because I've been quietly investing in historic preservation projects throughout the region for the past 4 years. The documentation I spread across the table showed a pattern of property acquisitions and restoration projects that had transformed neglected historic buildings into vibrant community assets. The old Westfield Theater that had been renovated into a performing arts center. The abandoned mill building that now housed artists, studios, and a community workshop space. The Victorian mansion that had been converted into affordable housing for seniors. Each project was designed to preserve historic character while meeting current community needs, I explained, showing before and after photographs that demonstrated the scope of the transformation. The theater project alone took 2 years and cost nearly $3 million, but it created a cultural center that serves the entire county. Derek was flipping through the photographs with increasing amazement, pausing at images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and community celebrations that had marked the completion of each project. I remember when the theater reopened, the whole town was talking about the mysterious investor who had made it possible. I prefer to let the projects speak for themselves rather than taking credit, I said, echoing the philosophy that had guided both my charitable giving and my business development. The goal is to create spaces and opportunities that benefit the community, not to build name recognition for myself. Victoria was studying a photograph of the mill building conversion, where the ground floor now housed a farmer's market and community meeting space, while the upper floors contained affordable artist studios. The economic impact of these projects must have been substantial. Local construction jobs, ongoing employment at the facilities, increased property values in the surrounding areas. Economic development was always part of the strategy, I confirmed, but so was preserving the character and history that make Westfield County special. Too many communities lose their identity when they prioritize growth over preservation. I wanted to demonstrate that you can have both if you plan carefully and invest thoughtfully. The scope of what I'd accomplished was beginning to register with all three of them, but I could see that Victoria was struggling with something deeper than simple surprise at my financial success. The woman who had spent 18 months treating me as an unwelcome intruder was confronting the reality that I had been contributing more to her community's well-being than most lifelong residents. "I need to ask you something directly," Victoria said, her voice carrying a vulnerability I'd never heard before. "If you've been this successful, this generous, this involved in community development, why did you let us treat you the way we have? Why didn't you defend yourself or set the record straight?" It was the question that got to the heart of everything that had transpired between us, the mystery that had driven my decisions throughout our relationship. The answer required me to explain not just what I'd done, but why I'd chosen to endure months of dismissive treatment when I could have ended it at any time. Because I needed to know whether Derek's family could love someone they thought had nothing to offer except herself, I replied, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "I needed to know whether you were the kind of people who would judge someone's worth by their bank account or their background, and whether Derek would stand up for me even when he thought I couldn't protect myself." The truth of my strategy was both simple and devastating. By maintaining my cover as a struggling bakery worker, I had created a perfect test of character that revealed exactly who the Hartwell family was when they thought there were no consequences for their behavior. "You were evaluating us," Cassandra said, her voice carrying a mixture of understanding and dismay. "I was protecting myself," I corrected. "I've seen what happens when wealthy families accept someone they consider beneath them only because that person turns out to have money. The acceptance is conditional, based on financial status rather than genuine respect or affection. I needed to know whether your family could love me for who I am, not what I have." Derek was looking at me with an expression that combined admiration with something that might have been sorrow. "And what did you learn?" The question hung in the air between us, impossible to avoid and equally impossible to answer without causing pain. The past 18 months had provided abundant evidence of how the Hartwell family treated people they considered their social and economic inferiors, and no amount of revisionist history could change that record. "I learned that you would defend me even when you thought I was powerless to defend myself," I said to Derek, squeezing his hand gently. "I learned that you love me for who I am, not what I represent or what I can provide. That's precious, Derek. That's the foundation of a marriage that can withstand anything." Victoria's face was tight with emotion, and I could see her struggling with the implications of what I'd revealed about both my circumstances and theirs. "And what did you learn about us?" The question demanded honesty, even if that honesty was painful to deliver and even more painful to receive. Victoria and Cassandra had failed my test spectacularly, revealing themselves to be exactly the kind of people who would treat someone badly based on perceived social and economic differences. "I learned that you're capable of being kind and generous when it costs you nothing," I replied carefully, "and that you're also capable of being cruel when you think someone can't fight back."
I learned that your treatment of people is based more on what you think they can do for you than on who they are as human beings. The words settled over the room like a cold wind, carrying truths that were impossible to deny or Victoria's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely, and I saw tears forming in her eyes as she confronted the reality of how she'd behaved when she thought it didn't matter. "I've made terrible mistakes," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been cruel and dismissive and everything I raised my children not to be. I don't know how to begin making amends for that." Derek reached across the table to take his mother's hand, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mom, recognizing the problem is the first step toward fixing it. But you need to understand that this isn't just about apologizing to Natalie. This is about examining how you treat all the people you encounter who don't have the power to fight back." It was a conversation that had been years in the making, and I could see that Derek was grappling with his own complicity in his family's behavior. He had witnessed their treatment of service workers, their dismissive attitudes toward people from different economic backgrounds, their assumption that wealth conferred moral superiority. My revelation had forced him to confront not just their behavior toward me, but their entire approach to interacting with the world. "There's something else I need you to understand," I said, addressing all three of them. "This evening when you suggested that I should settle for a church basement or community center because that's all someone like me deserved, you weren't just insulting me, you were revealing your belief that a person's worth is determined by their financial circumstance." Victoria flinched as if I'd struck her, but I continued because the lesson was too important to leave incomplete. "Every person who serves you coffee, cleans your house, delivers your packages, or rings up your purchases at the store deserves the same basic respect and kindness you would show to anyone else. Their job doesn't define their worth, their paycheck doesn't determine their dignity, and their circumstances don't justify condescension." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Where before there had been shock and defensive positioning, now there seemed to be genuine reflection in the beginning of understanding. Victoria was looking at her hands, perhaps thinking about all the interactions she'd had with service workers over the years, all the opportunities she'd missed to treat people with genuine kindness rather than polite dismissal. "I work at Henderson's Bakery because I love the work and because it keeps me connected to my community," I continued. "But even if I worked there because it was the only job I could find, even if I needed that paycheck to survive, even if I had no other options or opportunities, I would still deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. My value as a human being wouldn't be any less because my circumstances were different." Derek was nodding slowly, understanding not just the personal dimension of what I was saying but the broader social implications. "You're right, and I'm ashamed that it took this conversation for me to fully recognize how my family has been treating people for years." "Recognition is the beginning of change," I replied, "but change requires action, not just awareness. It requires examining every interaction, every assumption, every judgment you make about people based on their appearance or circumstances." Victoria looked up from her hands, her eyes red but determined. How do we begin to make this right? Not just with you but with all the people we've treated poorly over the years." It was the first genuine question she'd asked me in 18 months, the first time she'd sought my opinion rather than dismissing my perspective. The transformation was remarkable, but I knew that real change would require sustained effort rather than momentary remorse. "You can start by paying attention," I said simply. "Notice how you interact with service workers. Listen when people speak instead of waiting for your turn to talk. Ask questions about their lives and interests instead of making assumptions based on their job or appearance. Treat everyone you encounter as a complete human being worthy of respect and kindness." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. Victoria and Cassandra began sharing memories of times when they'd dismissed or looked down on people who worked in service positions, recognizing patterns of behavior that had become so automatic they'd stopped noticing them. Derek talked about his own complicity in creating an environment where such attitudes were acceptable, even expected. As the evening wore on, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Not just hope that my relationship with Derek's family could be repaired, but hope that they were capable of genuine growth and change. The shock of learning about my true circumstances had created an opening for honest conversation about values and behavior that might never have occurred otherwise. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," I said as the conversation began to wind down. "Thomas Reynolds, the manager at Rosewood Manor, has been instructed to treat our wedding planning exactly as he would for any other client. No special consideration because I own the property, no behind-the-scenes coordination that would make the planning process artificial." Derek looked puzzled, Why would you want to make it more difficult for yourself? Because I want our wedding planning to be real, I replied. I want us to make decisions together, to navigate challenges together, to create something beautiful together, without shortcuts or special advantage. The venue is my gift to us, but the wedding itself should be our collaborative creation. Victoria was listening intently, and I could see her beginning to understand that my approach to our relationship, like my approach to business and community involvement, was guided by principles that went deeper than mere financial consideration. That's why you've been so involved in the planning details, she said with dawning understanding. Why you've asked so many questions about vendor relationships and coordination logistics. You weren't just being a thorough bride, you were ensuring that your professional knowledge didn't interfere with your personal experience. Exactly, I confirmed. I want to remember our wedding as the day Derek and I became husband and wife, not as another successful event I coordinate. The professional side of me will always be there, but it shouldn't dominate what should be the most personal day of our lives. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of our modest apartment, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors, as I prepared for what would be the most important conversation of my professional life. 3 weeks had passed since the revelation at the Hartwell family dinner, and the aftermath had been both more complicated and more rewarding than I could have anticipated. Derek had spent those weeks reassessing not just his family's behavior but his own assumptions about class, privilege, and the ways people treat one another based on perceived social status. He'd begun volunteering at the Senior Nutrition Center, where I'd been quietly funding meal programs, working alongside the elderly residents I'd helped support and learning their stories in ways that no amount of charitable giving could accomplish alone. Victoria had surprised me most of all. Rather than retreating into defensive embarrassment, she had thrown herself into what she called her education and empathy with the same intensity she'd once applied to planning society gatherings. She'd enrolled in a community college sociology course, begun volunteering at the literacy program I'd funded, and started what she described as listening tours of local businesses, where she engaged service workers in genuine conversations about their experiences and aspirations. Cassandra's transformation had been quieter but equally significant. She'd taken a part-time job at a local nonprofit that provided job training and placement services for people transitioning out of poverty, discovering talents for program development and client advocacy that her privileged upbringing had never allowed her to explore. But today's conversation would determine whether these individual transformations could translate into something larger and more lasting. I was meeting with Thomas Reynolds at Rosewood Manor to finalize the details of a proposal that would fundamentally change how the venue operated, and hopefully, how the luxury hospitality industry approached issues of social responsibility. Thomas greeted me in the Manor's oak-paneled library, surrounded by architectural plans and sustainability reports that represented months of collaborative planning. His distinguished bearing and impeccable manners hadn't changed since our first meeting, but our working relationship had evolved into something approaching partnership as we developed the vision for Rosewood Manor's future. Miss Brooks, he said, rising from behind an antique writing desk that had once belonged to the estate's original owners, I've completed the final staffing projections for the Community Employment Initiative. The numbers are even more promising than we initially projected. The Community Employment Initiative was the cornerstone of my plan to transform Rosewood Manor from an exclusive luxury venue into what I was calling a conscious hospitality destination. Rather than simply hiring experienced service workers from other high-end establishments, we would partner with local job training programs to provide employment opportunities for people who might otherwise never have access to careers in luxury hospitality. Show me the breakdown, I said, settling into a leather armchair and accepting the steaming cup of coffee that Thomas had prepared using beans from Henderson's bakery. Even in this elegant setting, I insisted on maintaining connections to the community relationships that had shaped my understanding of authentic service. Thomas spread the staffing charts across the mahogany table between us, his finger tracing organizational structures that represented a radical departure from traditional luxury venue operation. We'll be able to provide full-time positions for 37 individuals currently enrolled in job training programs, with advancement pathways that could lead to supervisory and management roles within 18 months. The initiative went far beyond simply hiring people who needed work. We had partnered with community colleges to develop specialized hospitality training programs that would provide participants with transferable skills valuable throughout the industry. Graduates would be equipped not just to work at Rosewood Manor, but to advance their careers at any luxury establishment, or to start their own service businesses. The compensation packages, I asked, though I already knew the answer would exceed industry standards by a significant margin. Starting salaries 20% above regional averages for comparable positions, with comprehensive health benefits, educational support for continued training, and profit-sharing opportunities tied to guest satisfaction ratings. Thomas replied, "We're also establishing a revolving loan fund to help employees with professional development expenses or emergency financial needs." It was an investment in human capital that traditional luxury venues would consider financially unsustainable, but my business experience had taught me that exceptional service came from employees who felt valued and supported rather than merely hired. The profit margins at Rosewood Manor would be lower than at comparable facilities, but the service quality and client satisfaction would be unprecedented. What about the vendor partnership? I continued moving through the checklist that would determine whether our vision could be successfully implemented. Thomas pulled out another set of documents, showing agreements with local farms, artisan producers, and small businesses that would supply everything from organic produce to handcrafted linen. 63% of our operational purchases will come from vendors within a 50-mile radius, with priority given to businesses owned by women, minorities, or individuals who have overcome significant economic challenges. The local sourcing initiative would create a ripple effect of economic development throughout Westfield County, supporting sustainable agriculture, traditional craft, and small-scale manufacturing, while ensuring that Rosewood Manor's luxury offerings maintained the authenticity and quality that discerning clients expected. The environmental sustainability metrics are equally impressive. Thomas continued, showing me reports on the renewable energy installations, waste reduction programs, and carbon offset initiatives that would make Rosewood Manor one of the most environmentally responsible luxury venues in the country. We project achieving carbon neutrality within 2 years and carbon negativity within 5 years. As Thomas walked me through the comprehensive transformation plans, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere business success. Rosewood Manor would become a demonstration project showing that luxury hospitality could be both profitable and socially responsible, that exceptional experiences could be created in ways that benefited entire communities, rather than extracting value from them. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek, reminding me about our appointment with the wedding photographer later that afternoon. The juxtaposition of personal wedding planning with revolutionary business development perfectly captured the complexity of my current life, where professional ambition and personal happiness were finally aligned rather than competing for my attention. "There's one more element we need to discuss," I said to Thomas, pulling out a folder containing the most sensitive aspect of our transformation plan, the family integration program. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly, though his professional composure never wavered. The family integration program was my solution to the problem of how to help the Hartwell family translate their newfound awareness into meaningful action while also ensuring that their transformation was genuine rather than performative. Victoria and Cassandra have both expressed interest in becoming directly involved in Rosewood Manor's community outreach initiatives, I explained, showing Thomas the detailed proposals they had submitted after weeks of research and planning. Victoria wants to establish a hospitality scholarship program for young people from underserved communities, while Cassandra is interested in developing a sustainable agriculture education program that would teach organic farming techniques to local residents. The proposals represented thousands of hours of work and demonstrated a level of commitment that went far beyond superficial attempts at redemption. Victoria had interviewed dozens of potential scholarship recipients, researched career pathways in luxury hospitality, and developed mentorship structures that would provide ongoing support for program participants. Cassandra had partnered with agricultural extension agents, studied permaculture techniques, and designed curricula that would help local farmers transition to sustainable growing methods. Both programs would be funded through the Rosewood Manor Community Foundation, which I'm establishing with an initial endowment of $5 million. I continued, watching Thomas's expression carefully. Victoria and Cassandra would serve as unpaid program coordinators, working directly with participants and taking full responsibility for program outcomes. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of integrating my former antagonists into the venue's social responsibility initiatives. "You're giving them the opportunity to prove their transformation through service rather than simply through apology." "Exactly," I confirmed. "Talk is easy, but sustained commitment to helping others requires genuine character change. If Victoria and Cassandra are serious about becoming better people, this will provide them with meaningful ways to contribute while holding them accountable for actual results." The family integration program was perhaps the riskiest element of my entire transformation plan, but it was also potentially the most impactful. If successful, it would demonstrate that even people with deeply ingrained prejudices could change and contribute positively to their community. If unsuccessful, it would provide clear evidence that their apparent transformation was merely temporary embarrassment rather than lasting growth. What about Derek? Thomas asked. Will he be involved in the community programs as well? Derek's role in the Rosewood Manor transformation was more complicated because he hadn't been guilty of the same systematic prejudices as his mother and sister. His challenge was different, learning to recognize and interrupt systems of privilege that he had previously taken for granted. Derek will be working with the Employee Advancement Program, I explained, showing Thomas the mentorship structure we had developed. He'll be paired with program participants who are interested in pursuing education degrees, providing guidance on navigating higher education systems, and career development in teaching and education administration. It was work that built on Derek's existing strengths, while challenging him to understand the barriers that prevented many capable individuals from accessing educational opportunities. His participants would include single mothers working to complete their degrees, recent immigrants, with professional qualifications that weren't recognized in the United States, and individuals who had been discouraged from pursuing education because of their economic circumstance. Thomas was reviewing the program structures with growing approval, recognizing the comprehensive nature of what we were creating. This is unprecedented in the luxury hospitality industry. The potential for replication at other venues, the model for socially responsible luxury services, the demonstration that profitability and community benefit can be aligned rather than opposed. That's the goal, I agreed. But first we need to prove that it can work at Rosewood Manor. The wedding season will be our test case, showing whether high-end clients will embrace conscious luxury or whether they prefer traditional exclusivity.
The upcoming wedding season would bring some of the wealthiest and most demanding clients in the region to Rosewood Manor, providing the ultimate test of whether our community-centered approach could deliver the flawless experiences that luxury clients expected. Every event would be an opportunity to demonstrate that exceptional service could come from empowered employees working for fair wages, that locally sourced ingredients could exceed imported delicacies, and that manor mill responsibility could enhance rather than compromise the luxury experience. Speaking of weddings, Thomas said with a subtle smile, how are the preparations for your own celebration progressing? My wedding to Derek had become something more than a personal celebration. It had evolved into a symbol of transformation and possibility that would be witnessed by family, friends, and professional colleagues who had varying degrees of knowledge about the changes we had all undergone over the past few months. Complicated, I admitted, though my smile indicated that the complications were mostly positive ones. Planning a wedding when you secretly own the venue requires a level of acting ability I didn't know I possessed. Derek thinks we're being incredibly lucky with vendor negotiations and menu selection. The challenge of maintaining the illusion that I was simply another bride working with Thomas to plan her perfect day had become increasingly difficult as our professional collaboration deepened. Derek had begun commenting on my unusually sophisticated questions about logistics and my uncanny ability to suggest solutions to problems that arose during the planning process. He's starting to suspect something, I continued. Yesterday he asked me how I knew so much about the technical requirements for the sound system installation, and I had to pretend I'd researched it online rather than admitting I'd been part of the equipment selection process. Thomas chuckled, a rare display of personal amusement that suggested our working relationship had evolved beyond mere professional courtesy. Perhaps it's time to let him in on the secret. The revelation could be part of the wedding surprise. I've been thinking about that, I replied, considering the various ways I could reveal the truth to Derek without undermining the authenticity of our wedding planning experience. But I want him to understand that the venue ownership was never about the wedding itself. It was about creating something meaningful that would outlast our celebration. The timing of the revelation would be crucial because it would set the tone for how Derek understood my motivations and priorities. I needed him to see that purchasing Rosewood Manor hadn't been a romantic gesture or a demonstration of wealth. It had been a strategic decision to create lasting positive impact in our community while also providing us with the perfect setting for our commitment to each other. What if we made the revelation part of the ceremony itself? Thomas suggested, his event planning instincts offering a solution that was both dramatic and meaningful. A moment during the reception when you could share the larger vision for Rosewood Manor and invite your guests to be part of the community transformation we're creating. The idea was intriguing but risky. Our wedding guests would include Derek's professional colleagues from the school district, my contacts from the event planning industry, community leaders who had worked with my various charitable initiatives, and family members who were at different stages of understanding the changes we had all undergone. It could work, I said slowly, imagining how such a revelation might unfold. But it would need to be framed correctly, not as a surprise about wealth or ownership, but as an invitation to participate in something larger than ourselves. Thomas was nodding thoughtfully, recognizing the delicate balance required to make such a moment meaningful rather than merely shocking. A toast, perhaps, where you could share the vision for Rosewood Manor's future and invite everyone to contribute their own talents and resources to the community initiatives we're establishing. The concept was appealing because it would transform our wedding from a celebration of personal happiness into a launching point for collective action. Rather than simply revealing my ownership of the venue, I could use the moment to challenge our guests to consider their own roles in creating positive change in their community. I'll need to discuss it with Derek first, I said, though I was already beginning to envision how such a moment might unfold. He deserves to know about the venue ownership before our wedding guests do, even if the timing is just a few hours earlier. The conversation with Derek would be crucial because it would determine whether our marriage began with full transparency and shared commitment to the values that had driven my transformation of Rosewood Manor. His reaction would also indicate whether he was ready to embrace the level of social responsibility that would come with being married to someone whose business success had created opportunities for community impact. "There's something else we should discuss," Thomas said, his tone becoming more serious. "The media interest in Rosewood Manor's transformation has been significant. We've received inquiries from luxury hospitality industry publications, sustainability organizations, and social responsibility advocates who are interested in documenting our community employment and local sourcing initiatives." The media attention was both an opportunity and a challenge. Positive coverage could help other luxury venues adopt similar practices, creating industry-wide changes that would benefit communities throughout the country. However, too much publicity could compromise the authentic relationships we were building with employees and community partners by turning them into symbols rather than individuals. "What's your recommendation?" I asked, trusting Thomas's decades of experience in managing high-profile events and sensitive client relationships. "Selective engagement," he replied. "Choose one or two publications that align with our values and can tell the story thoughtfully rather than sensationally. Focus on the community impact and employee advancement rather than on your personal story or the dramatic family revelations." It was sound advice that reflected the same principles that had guided my approach to business and charitable giving throughout my career. The goal was always to highlight the work and its impact rather than seeking personal recognition or credit. "I agree," I said, making mental notes about which publications might be appropriate partners for sharing our story. "The focus should be on demonstrating that luxury hospitality can be a force for positive change rather than simply extracting value from community." Thomas gathered the reports and planning documents we had been reviewing, preparing to transition from our strategic discussion to the practical tasks that would bring our vision to reality over the coming month. "The next few weeks will be crucial as we finalize staff training protocols and complete the vendor partnership agreements. By the time of your wedding, Rosewood Manor will be fully operational as a conscious luxury destination." As I prepared to leave the library, I felt a profound sense of anticipation for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The transformation of Rosewood Manor represented everything I had learned about business success, community responsibility, and the power of authentic relationships to create positive change. My phone buzzed again with another message from Derek, this one including a photo of the engagement ring his grandmother had worn, which he was having restored as a surprise for our ceremony. The image reminded me that amid all the strategic planning and community development initiatives, our wedding remained first and foremost a celebration of love and commitment between two people who had found each other despite the obstacles their different backgrounds might have created. "Thomas," I said, pausing at the library door, "thank you for believing in this vision and for helping make it reality. What we're creating here will outlast any individual event or celebration." His smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had spent his career managing memorable occasions but had never before had the opportunity to create something with such lasting significance. "Mrs. Brooks, it has been my privilege to help transform a venue into a catalyst for community change. Your wedding will mark the beginning of something unprecedented in our industry." As I drove back toward town, passing the familiar landmarks of Westfield County that had been my home for the past 6 years, I reflected on the distance traveled since that first family dinner when Victoria had dismissed my venue aspirations with such confident contempt. The woman who had assumed I couldn't afford a proper wedding was about to discover that I hadn't just booked the venue of my dreams, I had transformed it into a model for how business success could be leveraged for community benefit. More importantly, the tests and challenges of the past few months had revealed that Derek's love for me was indeed based on who I was rather than what I represented, and that his family's capacity for growth and change exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Our wedding would celebrate not just our commitment to each other but our shared commitment to using privilege and resources in service of values larger than ourselves. The morning of our wedding arrived with the kind of pristine clarity that photographers dream about and brides interpret as divine approval. From the bridal suite windows at Rosewood Manor, I watched the grounds crew making final preparations to gardens that had been transformed over the past month into something that exceeded even my professional expectations. Derek was staying at his family's estate, following the tradition that we shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. What he didn't know was that I had spent most of the night in Thomas Reynolds' office, reviewing every detail of the day's logistics while also preparing for the conversation that would finally reveal the full scope of what I had created at Rosewood Manor. Victoria appeared in the doorway of the bridal suite carrying a silver tray with coffee and fresh pastries from Henderson's Bakery. Her transformation over the past months evident not just in her gentler demeanor but in her willingness to serve rather than be served. The woman who had once dismissed my work at the bakery was now proudly offering its products to our wedding guests as symbols of community connection and authentic quality. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked, setting the tray on an antique sideboard and pouring coffee into delicate porcelain cups that belonged to the Manor's original collection. "Ready," I replied, accepting the coffee and inhaling the familiar aroma that had marked so many early mornings at the bakery. "Ready for the wedding, ready for the marriage, and ready for Derek to understand everything we've been building here." Victoria's smile carried a warmth that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Her work with the Hospitality Scholarship Program had introduced her to dozens of young people whose talent and determination had challenged every assumption she'd ever made about the relationship between circumstances and character. "He's going to be amazed," she said, settling into a velvet armchair and regarding me with something approaching maternal affection. "Not just by your ownership of Rosewood Manor, but by the vision you've created for its future. The community employment program, the sustainability initiatives, the way you've integrated all of us into meaningful service." The past months had indeed transformed the entire Hartwell family in ways that continued to surprise me. Cassandra had discovered a genuine passion for sustainable agriculture that had led her to enroll in a master's degree program in environmental science. Derek had been so inspired by his work mentoring scholarship recipients that he was considering pursuing administration credentials that would allow him to develop educational programs on a larger scale. "What time does the photographer arrive?" Victoria asked, checking the schedule that had been coordinated down to the minute by Thomas and his newly trained staff. "In an hour," I replied, though the photography session would be unlike anything the photographer had ever documented. Along with the traditional bridal portraits and family photos, we would be capturing the first day of operation for Rosewood Manor's transformed approach to luxury hospitality. Every member of our service staff had undergone months of training that went far beyond traditional hospitality protocol. They had learned not just how to serve meals and coordinated events, but how to engage with guests as complete human beings deserving of respect and genuine care. The photographers would document not just our wedding celebration, but the beginning of a new model for how luxury venues could operate as forces for community empowerment. A gentle knock at the door interrupted my thoughts, followed by Thomas's distinctive voice asking permission to enter. He appeared in the doorway carrying a leather portfolio that contained the final documents I would need for the afternoon's revelation. "Miss Brooks," he said with his customary formality, "the last of the vendor deliveries have arrived, and I'm pleased to report that everything has exceeded our quality expectations. The local farm collective provided produce that rivals anything available through international suppliers, and the artisan linens from the textile cooperative are receiving admiring comments from your guests. The success of our local sourcing initiatives had been crucial to proving that conscious luxury could meet the exacting standards of discerning clients. Every element of our wedding, from the flowers grown in neighboring counties to the wines produced by sustainable vineyards within 100 miles of Rosewood Manor, demonstrated that environmental and social responsibility could enhance rather than compromise the luxury experience." "What about the media representatives?" I asked, knowing that several carefully selected journalists would be documenting our community-centered approach to luxury hospitality. "They arrived an hour ago and are already conducting interviews with staff members about the Employee Advancement Program," Thomas replied. "The responses have been overwhelmingly positive. Our team members are articulate advocates for what we're creating here." The decision to include media coverage of our wedding had been carefully considered, with the understanding that our personal celebration would serve as a launching point for broader conversations about social responsibility in the luxury hospitality industry. The coverage would focus on the business model and community impact rather than on personal drama or family dynamics. Victoria was reading through the media talking points we had prepared, familiarizing herself with the key messages about Rosewood Manor's transformation. Her role as a program coordinator had given her credibility to speak about the scholarship initiative and the ways that luxury venues could contribute to educational opportunities for underserved communities. "I keep thinking about the scholarship recipients who will be here today," she said, referring to the 12 young people whose hospitality education was being funded through the program she had developed. "6 months ago, I would never have imagined that some of the most impressive individuals I'd ever meet would be people I might have dismissed based on their backgrounds." It was a recognition that went to the heart of the transformation that had occurred not just in Victoria but in all of us. The process of working directly with people from different economic circumstances had revealed the arbitrary nature of many social distinctions and the tremendous waste of human potential that occurred when opportunities were distributed based on privilege rather than merit. My phone chimed with a text message from Derek, sent from his preparation suite across the manor grounds. He had awakened early to work with his mentorship participants on college application essays, continuing the educational support that had become central to his understanding of his role in creating positive change. "The photographer is here," Cassandra announced, appearing in the doorway with the kind of radiant smile that had become characteristic of her new engagement with meaningful work. Her agricultural education program had already enrolled 30 local residents in sustainable farming workshops, creating a network of environmentally conscious growers throughout Westfield County. The photography session that followed captured images that would become iconic representations of conscious luxury hospitality. Portraits of our wedding party included scholarship recipients, community partners, and local vendors alongside family members and longtime friends. The photographs told a story of celebration that encompassed individual happiness within a larger narrative of community transformation and social responsibility. As the morning progressed, guests began arriving for the afternoon ceremony, and I watched from the bridal suite windows as Thomas and his staff demonstrated the exceptional service that had been months in development. Every interaction between staff and guests reflected the training they had received in seeing service as an expression of dignity, rather than subservience. The guest list itself represented a cross-section of the community that had emerged around Rosewood Manor's transformation. Wealthy clients who had hired my event planning services mingled with bakery customers who had become personal friends. Scholarship recipients shared tables with community college instructors, and local farmers engaged in animated conversations with sustainable agriculture advocates from neighboring states. "It's time," Victoria announced, checking the antique clock that marked the final minutes before the ceremony would begin. She had volunteered to serve as my matron of honor, a role that symbolized the complete transformation of our relationship from antagonism to genuine affection and mutual respect. As we made our way through the manor's elegant corridors toward the ceremony site, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who had once suggested I should settle for a church basement wedding was now proudly escorting me toward a ceremony that would take place in gardens I owned, surrounded by communities I had helped support, celebrated by guests who represented every aspect of the life I had built in Westfield County. The ceremony itself was everything Derek and I had dreamed of, and more than we had dared to hope. Thomas had coordinated every detail flawlessly, from the musicians who had trained at community music programs, to the flowers that had been grown using sustainable techniques taught through Cassandra's agricultural workshop. Derek's face when he saw me walking down the aisle carried an expression of love and wonder that would be captured in photographs we would treasure for decades. His vows spoke not just of personal commitment but of shared dedication to using our resources and privileges in service of values larger than ourselves. My own vows included promises of love and partnership that extended beyond our individual relationship to encompass our commitment to the community that had nurtured us both. I spoke of the bakery work that had taught me the value of authentic relationships, the event planning business that had shown me the power of creating meaningful experiences, and the community development initiatives that had revealed our capacity to contribute to positive change. The reception that followed was unlike any wedding celebration our guests had ever experienced. Local musicians provided entertainment that ranged from classical performances by conservatory graduates to folk music by artists who had learned their craft from community elders. The meal showcased ingredients from the local food network we had helped establish, prepared by chefs who had been trained through our professional development program. But the most memorable moment of the evening came during the toast I had planned with such careful consideration over the preceding weeks. As our guests raised their glasses in celebration, I took Derek's hand and addressed the assembled community that had become central to our lives. "Tonight we celebrate not just our marriage, but our commitment to using love as a foundation for creating positive change in the world around us," I began, feeling Derek's hand tighten around mine as he sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. "Many of you know that Derek and I met at Henderson's Bakery,
where I still work because the relationships and connections formed there continue to enrich my life every day. What you may not know is that working at the bakery allowed me to build another kind of business, one focused on creating meaningful experiences for families and communities throughout our region. The murmur of interest that rippled through the crowd indicated that some guests were beginning to understand that this toast would reveal information they hadn't previously known. Derek was looking at me with growing curiosity, recognizing that my words were leading towards something unexpected. That business success created opportunities to give back to the community that had supported me, through anonymous contributions to local organizations and institutions. But it also created the opportunity to make a more visible and lasting contribution to our county's future. I paused, meeting Derek's eyes directly before continuing with the revelation that would transform his understanding of everything we had experienced together. 6 months ago, I purchased Rosewood Manor Estate with the goal of transforming it into a model for how luxury hospitality can serve as a catalyst for community empowerment and environmental sustainability. Tonight's celebration marks not just our wedding, but the official launch of Rosewood Manor as a conscious luxury destination. The silence that followed was broken by Derek's sharp intake of breath as the implications of my words registered fully. Around us, guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just a wedding reception, but the inauguration of a new approach to business and community engagement. The transformation you see around you tonight, from the locally sourced meal to the staff members who have been trained through our community employment program, represents what becomes possible when business success is leveraged for social good rather than personal aggrandizement. Derek's expression shifted from surprise to amazement to something approaching awe as he processed the scope of what I had accomplished and the vision we were now positioned to implement together. Our marriage begins with a shared commitment to using our resources, our relationships, and our privileges to create opportunities for others, while building a sustainable future for our community. We invite all of you to join us in this effort, contributing your own talents and passions to the work of positive transformation. The applause that followed was unlike anything I had experienced at any of the hundreds of events I had coordinated throughout my career. It was the sound of a community recognizing its own potential and committing to collective action in service of shared values. Derek pulled me aside as our guests continued celebrating, his eyes bright with love and excitement. "Natalie, what you've created here, what you've invited all of us to become part of, it's incredible. But why didn't you tell me about purchasing the manor?" "Because I needed to know that you loved me for who I am rather than what I own," I replied, echoing the explanation I had given his family months earlier. "And because I wanted our marriage to begin with full partnership rather than one person surprising the other with decisions that affect our shared future." "Our shared future," he repeated, his smile indicating complete understanding and enthusiastic embrace of the vision we would now implement together. "So what happens next?" "Next, we spend our honeymoon visiting other luxury venues that are experimenting with sustainable practices and community engagement," I said, pulling out an itinerary that Thomas had helped me develop. "Research for expanding the Rosewood Manor model to other locations and other communities." Derek's laughter was rich with joy and anticipation as he realized that our personal happiness and our professional mission had become inseparably intertwined. As the evening concluded and our guests departed with commitments to participate in various aspects of Rosewood Manor's community programs, I felt a profound sense of completion that went far beyond the satisfaction of a successful event. The tests and challenges of the past year had revealed that authentic love could indeed transcend differences in background and circumstances, that people were capable of genuine transformation when confronted with evidence of their own prejudices, and that business success could be leveraged to create positive change that extended far beyond individual profit. Victoria approached us as we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, her eyes bright with tears of joy and pride. "Natalie, what you've accomplished here, the way you've transformed not just this venue but all of us, it's given me hope that I can spend the rest of my life contributing something meaningful to the world." "You already are," I replied, embracing the woman who had become not just a mother-in-law but a genuine partner in creating positive change. "The scholarship program you've developed will change dozens of lives every year for decades to come." As Derek and I drove away from Rosewood Manor toward the beginning of our honeymoon and our married life together, I reflected on the distance we had all traveled from that first family dinner when Victoria had dismissed my venue aspirations with such confident contempt. The woman who had assumed I couldn't afford a proper wedding had instead witnessed the launch of a business model that would influence luxury hospitality practices throughout the industry. The family that had worried about my suitability had become active partners in community development initiatives that would benefit thousands of residents over the coming year. Most importantly, the love that Derek and I shared had proven capable of surviving the tests of class prejudice, family opposition, and the revelation of circumstances that dramatically altered the balance of power within our relationship. Our story had become proof that authentic connection transcends artificial social distinctions, that people are capable of remarkable growth when challenged to examine their assumptions, and that business success creates opportunities to contribute to positive change that extends far beyond individual achievement. The road ahead was filled with possibilities for expanding our model to other communities, developing new programs for education and economic empowerment, and continuing to demonstrate that luxury and social responsibility could be combined in ways that enhanced both individual experience and collective well-being. As we began our married life together, I knew that the greatest wedding gift we had received was not any material object but the opportunity to spend our lives creating meaningful positive change in partnership with a community that had embraced the vision of conscious luxury and shared prosperity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.